Hello everybody, this is Marta Silvera-Roig, and I want to welcome you to my presentation, What are Narratives Made of? Affective Neuroscience and Cross-Cultural Aspects, a Walk Through Emotions and Mirror Neurons. In the words of Turner, cultural meanings peculiar to a society often fail to migrate intact across anthropological or historical boundaries. But the basic mental processes that make these meanings possible are universal. We are talking here about narratives as a pre-linguistic tool of the mind, present in a state where cognition and emotion are undifferentiated. But what do we mean when we talk about mind, cognition, and emotion? In the late 1970s, the conception of the mind as a mere processor of information began to change. The second revolution in cognitive science was approaching. The 21st century is the century of the mind. Born in the second half of the last century, neuroscience grows exponentially from studies that investigate macroscopic connections to those that focus on tiny individual axons and synapses. In the ambitious task of creating a connectome, a map of neural connections, one of the most important goals is to understand how this neural activity creates experience and meaning. Neuroscience has no other way of existing than in interdisciplinarity. We are not just the brain, we are the continuous interaction of mind, body, and world in its infinite variables and forms. As we can see here in this figure from the article From Wide Cognition to Mechanisms, a Silent Revolution, cognition is embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive. For e-cognition is a relatively young and thriving field of interdisciplinary research. It assumes that cognition is shaped and structured by dynamic interactions between the brain, body, and both the physical and social environments. What is embodied cognition? The form of our behavior emerges from the real-time interaction between a nervous system in a body with particular capabilities and an environment that offers opportunities for behavior and information about those opportunities. The reason this is quite a radical claim is that it changes the job description for the brain. Instead of having to represent knowledge about the world and using that knowledge to simply output commands, the brain is now a part of a broader system that critically involves perception and action as well. The problem, however, is that this is not really what embodied cognition is about. Embodiment is not the weak claim that you can see small effects on the behavior of the body in our mental representations of the world. Embodiment is the radical hypothesis that the brain is not the sole resource we have available to us to solve problems. Our bodies and the meaning-filled perception of the world they allow do much of the work required to achieve our goals, and this simple fact changes utterly what the theories of cognition will look like. The inactive account of cognition is the most mysterious strand of current thinking in this area. At its heart lie notions of embodiment, self-organization, the environment, and the proposition that we enact the world. In words of Sean Gallagher and Ralph Lindgren, enactive approaches to cognition involve the idea that online sensory motor and affective processes shape the way the perceived thinker experiences the world and interacts with others. They argue for an approach to learning through whole-body engagement in a way that employs enactive metaphors. An enactive metaphor is one that we enact. That is, one that we put into action or one that we bring into existence. The fact that we are enacting a metaphor means that the action involved can be a kind of play acting or pretense, the kind of acting one finds in a theater or in the pretend play of a child. To enact a metaphor means to act it out, as enacting. This is an embodied process. In the words of Andy Clark and David Chalmers in describing the extended mind, perhaps some processing takes place in the environment, but what of mind? Everything so far is compatible with the view that truly mental states, experiences, beliefs, desires, emotions, and so on, are all determined by states of the brain. Perhaps what is truly mental is internal after all. However, they propose to take things a step farther. While some mental states, such as experiences, may be determined internally, there are other cases in which external factors make a significant contribution. In particular, they argue that beliefs can be constituted partly by features of the environment, when those features play the right sort of role in driving cognitive processes. If so, the mind extends into the world. The embedded thesis maintains that people exploit features of the physical and social environment to increase their cognitive capabilities. Creative cognition is embedded when people see with or see as tools, materials, decorative objects, or other features of their settings as things to think with, thereby extending their capabilities to understand complex problems. In linguistics, figures of speech once defined by their literary use began to establish themselves as essential cognitive tools of thought. The metaphor then re-emerged as an abstract structuring of thought and a way of constructing experiences of meaning. Lakoff and Johnson's publication Metaphors We Live By in 1980 became a touchstone. Thus was born the theory of conceptual metaphor, according to which the metaphor is not a specifically linguistic element, but a general cognitive mechanism. The metaphor is present in our daily life, not only in language, but in thought and action. In this way, a few years later, the paradigm shift materialized around the revolutionary idea that human cognition is the emergent activity of the interaction between brain, body, and world, and not a mind in the form of a software that develops in the hardware of the brain. As stated by one of the leading researchers in what will come to be called cognitive poetics, Marta, the mind is in essence artistic and literary. Thus, during the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the works of Turner, George Lakoff, and Mark Johnson created the foundations of a discipline whose approach places the literary studies at the center of the new theories of mind. Metaphor, imagination, and story are basic cognitive tools of language, of cognitive engagement in bodily experience, and are based on a non-reductionist approach that breaks with mind-brain dualism, reclaiming its physical and social environment. The reason is not completely conscious, but mostly unconscious, and it is inseparable from emotion. The embodiment theory has allowed new approaches in, among others, literary studies and the emergence of consciousness. According to Sunshine, the cognitive understanding of embodiment reintroduces the evolving human brain into literary and cultural criticism, and has the potential to enrich the study of discursive and cultural constructs that emanate from embodied cognition. Some of the existing models we have to encompass this exciting approach come from cognitive linguistics. In developing the notion of image schema, Johnson and Lakoff used the term image in its broad neurocognitive sense of mental imagery, and not as something that exclusively indicates visual imagery. Mental imagery can also be kinesthetic in the sense of our own body image. We plan motor movements thousands of times each day, constantly re-evaluating the extent of what is within our reach based on our body position. With some discontinuities, the body image in the primary sensory motor cortex is somatotopical. That means with adjacent neurons mapping largely contiguous sections of the body. Similarly, Cortical premotor maps are also somatotopical. Furthermore, in a series of recent studies in macaques and humans, Fogazzi, Rizzolatti, Buchino, Gallese, and their collaborators have found that sensory-motor cortices not only map peripersonal space, the space within our reach, but also contain mirror neurons with which the premotor cortex simulates the actions carried out by another monkey or another human. For example, when a monkey watches another monkey perform a task of grasping something with his hands, mirror neurons activate the premotor regions of the cortex of the monkey's own hand. According to recent studies, sensory-motor cortical regions play a more relevant role than previously thought in semantic comprehension tasks. Some research shows that it is possible to activate somatomotor neuronal maps using linguistic inputs as opposed to perceptual ones. Therefore, it is possible that the image schema has a neurobiological anchor in the neuronal maps that represent somatomotor and multimodal imaging tasks. According to several experimental results in action phrases from cognitive psychology, there is neurological and neuroimaging evidence that shows that mental imagery carried out in the premotor and multimodal somatosensory cortices is essential for semantic understanding. Many other experiments on the relationship between embodied cognition and language show a facilitating or inhibiting effect on the accuracy and/or speed of response in a diverse set of linguistic comprehension tasks. Yes, we understand an action phrase because we are subconsciously imagining ourselves performing that action. The image schema has phenomenological, linguistic, evolutionary, and neural implications when it comes to explaining preconceptual and pre-verbal structures of human experience, which can only be approached in terms of intermodal factors. In recent years, emotions have been the focus of study in many disciplines, especially neuroscience, which however did not take them so much into account in the past. We believe that the development of the newcomer affective neuroscience is key to understanding human motivation in all dimensions of its existence. Emotions are a major factor in the interaction between environmental conditions and human decision processes with emotional systems, which underlie the activation of somatic states that provide valuable implicit or explicit knowledge when making quick and advantageous decisions. Thus, the involvement of somatic markers in decision-making is anchored in the human emotional part, even if we recognize subtle cultural differences in emotion perception. According to the neurobiologist Antonio Damasio, emotions correspond to specific groups of changes in the body and brain. Each emotion is evoked by perception and influenced by thoughts or memories. Changes in the body, called somatic or bodily states, can include changes in facial expression, posture, hormones, heartbeat, and muscle contraction. On the other hand, the brain changes correspond to discharges of neurotransmitters. These changes also include mental representations of bodily changes. These representations are coded or roughly classified in the complex displays of physiological changes, and each code or signal corresponds to a specific pattern of bodily states. Mental representations of bodily changes provoke a subjective experience or feeling. Anger, for example, can provoke a mental representation that the blood flow has increased in the upper part of the body and other bodily states, without coding every somatic change. Body changes after emotions can be evoked by two types of objects and events: primary and secondary inducers. Primary inducers cause pleasant or unpleasant states. For example, the inducer can be from a snake to the solution of a problem. Secondary inducers are thoughts or memories of a primary inducer. When we evoke these thoughts or memories, we provoke their corresponding somatic states. The secondary inducer pathway is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. When this region is damaged, subjective feelings in response to emotional memories decrease. When humans need to decide between two alternatives, information about them is received in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This region then transmits an output to the hypothalamus and other structures that generate somatic states. These somatic states can affect us in several ways, highlighting feelings before an individual experience, increasing or decreasing the threshold to activate these states in the future, or influencing regions associated with working memory. Beccara highlights that in general, emotions influence working memory and decisions to improve behaviors. Thus, decisions can incorporate previous experience and its pleasant or negative responses and feelings. Future studies in the field of affective neuroscience, in conjunction with other disciplines such as neuroaesthetics or biopoetics, could notably enrich our knowledge about the integration of emotions into models of meaning, the emotional emergence in art, or the aesthetic experience of reading a literary text. As stated by Marshall, the universality of narratives suggests an important adaptive goal in human evolution. Some of the hypotheses in this regard suggest that narratives prepare us for specific situations, provide us with the ability to predict or understand the thoughts, feelings, motives, and reactions of others, what psychologists call theory of mind, and to understand that others may perceive something differently from us. The fact of understanding that others may not perceive something as we do is a very complex and sophisticated mental operation, and narratives train us in the notion that many misunderstandings and dissonances arise from this fact. Therefore, narratives meet our needs as an ultra-social species, helping us to manage the abundant interpersonal interactions of our daily lives. The artistic experience is a process of the embodied mind. The vital feelings that emerge from the bodily existence create the basis for the following stages of development and of the aesthetic experience itself. Bodily experience is inseparable from emotional reactions, which play a central role in memory, cognition, and consciousness. When we observe someone move, our mirror neurons simulate these movements. And through other types of mirror neurons, we can feel what emotion of the facial expressions of another person is suggesting us. As Latham Johnson stated, our conscious processes are built on functions that serve to control our embodied mind and their movements in space. Hence, the structural characteristic of metaphor and its biological attachment to narratives. On the other hand, feelings represent both mental and bodily states, and their processes take place through innate dispositions. For this reason, an approach that assumes that human experiences are intimately linked to concrete specifications of the embodied mind is an integrative approach, in contrast to classical semiotic models that presupposed an abstract language approach to interpretation without specifying how emotion, perception, cognition, and actions are part of a psychological whole. In words of Varela, cognition is highly dependent on the types of bodily experiences in its biocultural environment. In his study from the neuroaesthetics of literature, Burke has coined the term oceanic cognition to describe literary reception. According to the idea of oceanic cognition, it is not located in different brain areas that converge unidirectionally, but rather it is distributed in a succession of mixtures and combinations of basic and multi-directional neural processes. In a recent article cited by Burke, Arthur Jacobs has analyzed the methods and models that investigate the neural and cognitive affective basis of literary reception. The study begins with the observation that we still know very little about how the brain creates and processes poetic and literary text. However, because poetic and literary discourses combine thought and language, prosody and imagery, along with pleasure and emotion, they are unique and valuable material in explaining the complexities involved in the construction of meaning in the human brain. In Wendy Wheeler's The Whole Creature, emerging complexity is at the heart of both natural and cultural systems, and both are seen as semiotic processes. In Embodiment and Cognitive Science, Raymond Gibbs, Jr. proposes that the emergent nature of image schemas as embodied in the modern simulations is best understood theoretically in terms of the complex interaction of brain, body, and world. Thus, image schemas can be described as emergent properties, the type of structural coupling between brain, body, and world that arises from the different operational cycles that constitute the life of the human being. Image schemas reflect the form of stability within cognitive systems. According to self-organization theory, the order of a system arises around attractors that help create and maintain stable patterns within the system. These attractors are preferred patterns, in such a way that the initial condition of a system will evolve until it reaches these attractors and will remain so in the absence of other factors. In this conceptual metaphor, from The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, the meaning construction motivated by the image schema container marks in a significant way the spatial disposition as a ubiquitous feature. In this case, the linguistic metaphoric expression, to the verge of being forgotten, places the character pierced in a non-equilibrium status that will keep on being visible in the narrative. The force behind the movement taking out an element of container is the main character Edipa. This way, we do not know the relationship characteristics, but we know that she wanted to forget him. In this case, the non-equilibrium situation brings out past feelings. As we have seen, the relational actions of the image schemas and their inherently embodied and dynamic structure might function as attractors outlining the chaotic trajectory of narratives, the changing configurations in space that make up the image schemas correspond to emotional mental states. According to the somatic marker hypothesis, emotional processes are related to body and regulatory state structures, even when these do not arise in the body, but in the mind representations of it. Therefore, the emotional mind cannot be separated from the cognitive mind, so the processes of our thoughts are intrinsically linked to the processes of our emotional responses and feelings, which create the universal narrative mind. Thank you very much for your attention, and do not hesitate to contact me to comment on any topic of this presentation.